think it's time to begin again. So we're starting session 5 now, where we're going to look at this Vipassana practice of no self. So this is the second to last session. The next one also will be looking at this practice of no self. And in this session, we'll start with another meditation on the Vipassana practice, coming to the insight of suffering. We'll then begin with, after that, with a short review of some of the earlier points. And before we go on to this topic of no self, we'll look a little bit at the qualities of suffering. Then we'll look at is there a self or is there no self? We'll look at the actual practice and we'll do a meditation on no self, some tips for that practice, and then time for some question answer at the end of the session. And so we'll begin with a meditation similar to last time. So we'll be investigating the human condition in terms of suffering, dukkha. In this meditation, though, we'll look at the 3 levels of dukkha individually. The first level was the dukkha of suffering, the unpleasant experiences. The second one was the dukkha of change, the pleasant experiences. And at the deepest level, the all-pervasive dukkha. And so we'll look at those 3 levels. And for the first one, for the unpleasant, what I'll get you to do is just deliberately bringing to mind some unpleasant experiences and observing those on the basis of the question, is this unpleasant experience in the nature of suffering, or is it our reaction to unpleasantness that leads to suffering? So with these questions, we're not trying to intellectually answer them. We're trying to answer them through observation, direct observation. Then the second stage of the meditation I'll get you to bring to mind some pleasant experiences, and similar to the last meditation, then investigate, observe those experiences on the basis of the question, is this pleasant experience in the nature of happiness, or could it lead to dissatisfaction? And then the last stage or last part of the meditation, you can just deliberately bring to mind all sorts of various experiences, pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral, and observe those experiences on the basis of the question, is this experience completely free of the potential for suffering to arise? So this is a much more subtle question. This is the deepest level, but let's have a go at it in this Vipassana practice. So if you'd like to find a nice, comfortable posture, let's begin that meditation. Setting the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. Back straight and body relaxed. And having established a good posture, then keeping the body as still as possible, avoiding any unnecessary movement. The breathing flowing naturally and effortlessly. and setting the mind in a state of ease and relaxation. Simply allowing the mind to come to rest in the stillness of the present moment. And we can begin our Vipassana practice of investigating the human condition. In the first stage of the meditation, deliberately bring to mind unpleasant experiences and observe those unpleasant experiences on the basis of the question, is this unpleasant experience in the nature of suffering, or is it our reaction to the unpleasantness that leads to suffering? Remember, we're not trying to intellectually answer that question. We're trying to answer that question based on our direct observation. Is this unpleasant experience in the nature of suffering? Or is it our reaction to the unpleasantness that leads to suffering? Bringing various unpleasant experiences to mind and observing them on the basis of this question. And now deliberately bring to mind various pleasant experiences and observe each of those pleasant experiences based on the question, is this pleasant experience in the nature of happiness, or could it lead to dissatisfaction? And now, for the final part of the Vipassana practice, bring to mind various experiences, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, and observe and investigate these experiences based on the question, is this experience completely free of the potential for suffering to arise? Or could suffering arise at any moment? And we can bring the meditation to a close. And let's begin with a short review. In this Vipassana practice, we are overcoming various distorted views, gaining insights, various insights into nature of reality. The four main distorted views that we are focusing on here in this retreat and the next retreat are seeing things which are changing as unchanging, tending to see pleasure as happiness, where there's no self as self, and things which are dependent as independent. And so in this retreat, we're focusing on the first three of those to come to these three insights to overcome those three distorted views, the insights into impermanence, suffering, no self, called the three marks of existence. Whereas in the next retreat, we'll be mainly focusing on the fourth insight, the insight into emptiness, to overcome this distorted view, grasping onto things which are dependent as independent. And we saw there that the first of the three Vipassana practices for this retreat, the Vipassana practice of impermanence, the benefits of this is that if we can bring that intellectual understanding into experience through Vipassana practice, that's going to start to reduce our craving and attachment to all the pleasant things that we experience. And thereby actually will enjoy those pleasant experiences much more due to the reduction in craving and attachment. Also, we'll find that we'll be more in harmony with the flow of life, using it to our advantage rather than fighting against it, trying to hold on to the pleasant things in our life and trying to push away the unpleasant things in our life. And also this insight into impermanence sets us up very well for gaining insights into suffering, no self, and emptiness. We already have seen that by gaining an insight into impermanence, that everything's changing moment by moment, can really help us to let go of the false grasping that pleasure is happiness, because we'll really see that our pleasurable experiences are transient. They're not in the nature of genuine happiness. And also, as we're about to see, that this insight into impermanence is going to be very helpful to come to realize no self. Because if we can see that our body and mind and everything is in a constant flow, then where is there a self to be found in that flow? And similarly, then in the next retreat, the insight into impermanence will set us up well for an insight into emptiness. Because if we, again, can experientially things is a constant flow state, well, where is there a thing to be found in that flow? Nothing there exists objectively. And we also saw just now that the benefits of doing this Vipassana practice to come to an insight into dukkha or suffering is, firstly, it helps to reduce attachment due to realizing there's no genuine happiness to be found out there. And then at the deepest level, we'll understand that this all-pervasive dukkha, that we're stuck in this unsatisfactory state. There's always a potential for suffering to arise because our mind is contaminated by the mental afflictions. And therefore, see that the source of suffering also lies within, and therefore we can develop a wish to be free, to be liberated from that suffering. This is called, often translated as renunciation. And also this, by developing this insight into suffering, we can see that everyone else is in the same situation as us, and that can be very helpful, helping to lead us to cultivate compassion for others as well, to see others that are also tormented by suffering. And so that brings us to the first topic in this session. Before we go on to the no self, just to talk a little bit more about suffering, and here we can talk about the qualities of suffering. Generally, suffering is something we don't want and we try to push it away or avoid it. But actually, if we are encountering suffering, then that can really help us a lot. In a very simple way, we can also understand that the times that we most developed as a person is not when things were going well, because if things are going well in our life, we tend just to float along and not really develop as a person. It's only when we're faced with difficulties, challenges, we're faced with suffering that challenge us that we really develop as a person. And so here in the meditation texts, and we see a quote here from the Lam Rim text from the great Tibetan master Tsongkhapa from the 14th century. And he says, suffering has 5 good qualities. The good qualities of 1, spurring you on to liberation, which is what we've just seen a little bit here, is that by appreciating that we're stuck in this state of dukkha or suffering, and that we can overcome that, that would, as Tsongkhapa said, spur us on to liberation, that we want to cultivate this wish to be free from suffering, to be liberated from this unsatisfactory state of dukkha. And this is often translated as renunciation, which also can be misleading, and I'll talk a bit more about that in the next slide. But also here, if we encounter suffering, that can help to dispel arrogance. Here, this means that if we're not suffering, we may have this arrogant attitude that, you know, I'm okay, I'm superior to others. Others are suffering, but not me. I'm fine. I don't really need to do anything. So we can dispel that arrogance to appreciate that we are also stuck in this situation. So that's very closely related to the first one of renunciation. The third quality of suffering is causing you to shun non-virtue. Because if we are suffering and we can see that really harmful behavior leads to suffering, then we don't want that. So that will inspire us to avoid non-virtue, to avoid harmful behavior that's just going to lead to suffering for ourselves and those around us. And the flip side of that is that by us encountering suffering, and actually instead of suffering, we want happiness, that would also help inspire us, Tsongkhapa says, causing you to cultivate virtue, to like cultivating virtue. Because if we want happiness, then by engaging in virtuous good behavior, that's going to help lead us to happiness. So for us, encountering suffering, not only will it inspire us to be more ethical, to avoid harmful behavior, but it will also inspire us to engage in good behavior, thereby help us to strive for happiness, to overcome that suffering as well. And then, as we already have seen, that by us suffering, then we can help cultivate compassion for others, because we can appreciate that we're not the only one suffering. Everyone else is in the same situation. And so therefore have empathy for others suffering, and then that can lead to us cultivating compassion for others. The wish to help liberate, the wish for others to be free of suffering and its causes, just like ourselves. So here then, the suffering has 5 good qualities. This doesn't mean, of course, we need to go out and search for suffering. We have enough suffering happening already, but we can learn and benefit from any suffering experiences we have in these 5 ways. What I'd like to do now is talk a little bit more about this renunciation, because again, like the First Noble Truth, that dukkha is translated to suffering, can be misleading. Similarly here, this term renunciation can be very misleading. So let's have a look at that. And renunciation is really posited as the entry point to the Buddhist spiritual path. And it's often presented in a way of giving up the 8 worldly concerns, that we need to renounce the 8 worldly concerns. And these 8 worldly concerns are listed at the bottom here, and they're really on the basis of this false view that the source of happiness and suffering is out there in the world. And therefore, in terms of trying to find happiness and overcome suffering, then we often tend to put a lot of effort in trying to accumulate money and wealth, because it seems like money and wealth is going to bring us happiness, and that's what gain means. So we put a lot of time and energy in accumulating wealth and possessions because it seems like they may be the source of our happiness. And similarly, it seems like if we don't have those or we lose them, that's going to be the source of a lot of suffering. So we put a lot of time and energy into avoiding losing those material possessions and wealth and so forth. And as we've already seen, we tend to equate pleasure with happiness, but we also tend to equate pain with suffering. And so therefore we put a lot of effort in trying to accumulate pleasant experiences because it seems like that is really happiness. And we put a lot of energy, time and energy to avoid any painful, unpleasant experiences because they seem to be suffering. But also in terms of our happiness, we often feel that it's important in terms of us having happiness, what people are saying about us. So we tend to put a lot of emphasis and effort into actions which will lead others to praise us, to say good things about us, because it seems like that's going to make us happy. And similarly, we try to avoid any sorts of situations where others are blaming us for things, particularly things we didn't do, because blame seems to be the source of our suffering as well. But also in terms of crucial for our happiness, we often also we not only think that it's important what people are saying about us for our happiness, but what people are thinking about us for us to be happy. So we put a lot of effort in trying to develop a good reputation, to be respected and admired and so forth, because we feel like if we have that good reputation, that's going to bring us a lot of happiness. And that if we have a bad reputation, that's simply going to lead to suffering. So these are the 8 worldly concerns. And so we put a lot of effort into these 8 worldly concerns. We put a lot of effort in trying to gain the ones on the left, and we put a lot of effort trying to avoid the things on the right because they seem to be the source of our suffering. And so here, this renunciation is about giving up the 8 worldly concerns. But when that renunciation is presented, then often people have a misunderstanding. And they think that if I want to be really a good Buddhist, renunciation means I have to give up all my money and my pleasure and praise and good reputation. That's not what it means. So we're not talking about giving up the 8 worldly things. We're giving up the 8 worldly concerns. Whether or not we have money, wealth, pleasure, praise, good reputation, that's not the important thing. The important thing is our attitude to these things. That's what we need to correct. If our attitude is that the things on the left are the source of happiness and the attitude is the things on the right is the source of suffering, then we're simply going to have attachment to those on the left, aversion to the things on the right, and we're just going to induce a lot of unnecessary suffering. And as Shantideva said before, out of delusion we'll destroy our own well-being as if it were our enemy. And so we're talking about giving up. Renunciation is about giving up an unhealthy attitude to these things, i.e. to give up attachment to the things on the left and aversion to the things on the right. And actually this term renunciation is not a very good translation anyway, because the original Sanskrit term here is ni-sarana. Ni, the prefix ni means out of, away from, and sarana means to move. So ni-sarana is the wish or aspiration to move out of, away from suffering towards happiness, to be liberated from suffering. So a better translation of the original term is the wish to be liberated from suffering. And so whenever we see this term renunciation in Buddhism, that's what it really means, is the wish to be liberated from suffering. And so that is one of the benefits of this Vipassana practice of coming to an insight into suffering or dukkha, is that it will lead us to cultivate that wish to be liberated from suffering, understanding that the source of suffering lies within our own mind. So that now brings us to the topic for this session and the third insight that we're looking at in this retreat, and that's the insight into self, no self. So, but the question is there a self or is there no self? And that really depends on how we use the word self. And we can use the word self in a number of different ways. We can use the word self simply mean person in terms of self versus others. And so then self exists. So if we're using the word self simply to mean me, the person, then of course I exist, the person exists. There is no Buddhist tradition that says we don't exist. The question is in Vipassana is not whether or not we exist, because to even ask the question, we have to exist. If we don't exist, we can't even ask the question. The question is not do we exist or not. The question is, how do we exist? And so here in the context of Vipassana practice, in that context, when we see the word self is referring usually to an overinflated false sense of me. And we overinflate the sense of me in a number of different ways, a number of different levels. And I've mentioned 3 here in this list. One way in which we overinflate the sense of me is we see ourselves existing as some sort of unchanging, unitary, independent person. Unitary here means a single thing. Such a self does not exist. But this sort of self, grasping at this sort of self, is something that is intellectually acquired through some sort of wrong way of thinking intellectually. Because an unchanging, unitary, independent person would imply that we could have a sense of self somewhere away from our body, somewhere over there. And we never have a sense of self that is not in some way associated with some aspect of the body and the mind. So the first one would be simply coming up with some sort of idea, a false idea of how we exist intellectually through some wrong intellectual way of thinking. So therefore, that one doesn't really cause us much problem. And even if we come to that wrong idea intellectually, that would be something very easy to eliminate through just thinking in a correct way. Whereas the next sense of self, this idea of autonomous person, this is something that we instinctively have, this false sense of me, this sense of an autonomous person. And this is what we're going to be focusing on in this and the next session. So this idea of an autonomous self is that instinctively, then there seems to be something more than just a body and a mind here. There seems to be a third thing, a me. So there seems to be 3 things here. There seems to be a body, a mind, and a me that has this body and mind. There seems to be these 3 things. And we have this in our language. We say, I have a body. I have a mind. As if there's this autonomous separate me that has a body and has a mind. A little bit like some sort of separate owner of the body and the mind. And we also have this sometimes, sometimes we may look at our body and we don't like what we see. And we sometimes have this thought, I'd like to swap this body for a younger, more healthy, more beautiful body. And sometimes we look at our mind and it's a bit of a mess. And sometimes we may have the thought, I'd like to swap this mind for a more caring, more wise, less neurotic mind. But where is the me that could do this swap? If we took out this body and mind, what's left over? Is there anything left over? So intellectually, it's quite easy to appreciate that there's not really anything left over. However, instinctively, this is a sense of me that we have. We're grasping onto this autonomous person, this autonomous self. There really does seem to be a me somewhere here that stands apart a little bit from the body and the mind. A me that has this body, a me that has this mind. The technical term for such grasping is we're grasping onto what's called a self-sufficient, substantially existent person. Self-sufficient, it means that there seems to be a me here that doesn't seem to need to rely on anything to exist, and it seems very substantial and solid and real. And often it's this sense of a me here that is a master or control or owner of this body and the mind. There's a me here who's running the show, a me who is trying to look after this body, a me who's trying to look after this mind, a me that's the owner of this body and mind. And instinctively, we have this sense of me, a me that seems to be a little bit more than just the body and the mind. And this, according to Buddhism, is a false sense of me. This is grasping to an autonomous self. And that's what we're going to look at and see, is there such an autonomous person here somewhere to be found? That's what we're going to look at in this session. But before we go to that, let's go to the fourth way of using the word self. And this is the one we're going to be looking at in the next retreat on emptiness. That we also can have this sense that there's an inherently existent person here. There's a me existing here from its own side. There's an independent me here and an independent objective world out there. A me, an inherently existent me, a self-existent me, a me that exists from its own side. In other words, a me that we can find here somewhere. That we also have, that false sense of me, of grasping to such a self. And that doesn't exist either. And that's what we're going to be looking at in the next retreat, the retreat on emptiness. But here we're going to look at this autonomous self. So this grasping to this autonomous self, this autonomous me, this me that seems to be somewhere here, but seems to be a little bit more than the body and the mind, a little bit extra than the body and the mind. This is something instinctive. We have this instinctive false sense of me. So it's not some wrong intellectual thinking. Why is this a problem? Why is it a problem to grasp onto this autonomous self here? Once we grasp onto this autonomous self, then everything this me experiences seems to, of course, exist independently of this autonomous me here. And therefore, the pleasant things we experience seem to be the source of our happiness, and the unpleasant things seem to be the source of our suffering. And therefore, that leads to attachment to those pleasant things, aversion to the unpleasant things. That's leading to all the other mental afflictions. It's driving our behavior and leading us to suffering. So that's how this grasping to this autonomous self really creates a lot of mental afflictions and suffering. Now, if we can come to realize no self, if we go into this Vipassana practice and come to a realization there is no autonomous self, then that will reduce and eventually eliminate mental afflictions, and thereby reduce and eventually eliminate all suffering, and we can achieve liberation from all mental afflictions and suffering. We can achieve this goal of nirvana. So this is the main insight in the Theravada traditions to help us to overcome mental affliction, suffering, and achieve liberation from suffering. So these are the benefits of this practice. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to do this practice. We're going to, again, follow the classic approach of applying mindfulness to body, feelings, mind, and phenomena. But we'll condense it a little bit here. We'll first apply mindfulness to body, means we'll observe the body and see, is there a self to be seen anywhere within the body? And then we'll put feelings and mind together, meaning observing any sort of feelings, observing all mental events, thoughts, emotions, memories, images, and is there a self to be seen anywhere there in the mind? And then the last part of the meditation will expand that out to all phenomena, meaning whatever is appearing to the mind, is there a self to be seen anywhere at all? And remember, it's an empirical investigation. So we are looking through our direct observation. Is there a self to be seen anywhere in our experience? And to introduce this a little bit more, I'll read a little bit from this Minding Closely, the book from Alan Wallace, on page 67. He says, "The final question is this: self or no self? What is it that you refer to as I and mine? Within all these appearances to your mind, is there something that is inherently yourself? Is some aspect of your mind, your will perhaps, or awareness itself, the real you? Is some structure in your brain, the prefrontal cortex, hippocampus, amygdala, or pineal gland, really you? Is any element within the matrix of your body and mind the direct referent of the word I? Is there anything in your body, thoughts, emotions, and consciousness whose very nature is definitely your own, is you? So that's what we're going to determine, we're going to look for in this practice. So again, just remember, we're not trying to intellectually answer, is there a self? We're trying to see if we can see this self, this autonomous self that seems to be here. And we're going to cycle again. We're going to start with the body, then the mind, and then we're going to look at all phenomena, all of our experiences. So we'll do those 3 steps in this practice. So if you'd like to find a nice, comfortable posture, let's begin. Setting the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. And relaxing more deeply with each out breath. And with each out breath, letting go of any thoughts that may have arisen, happily releasing them. And in particular, letting go of any expectations for this meditation. Letting go of all of these things. And simply allowing the mind to come to rest in the stillness of the present moment. And we can begin our Vipassana practice by applying mindfulness to the body. That is, observing the field of the body, investigating the body on the basis of the question, is there a self to be seen anywhere within the field of the body? Remember, not trying to intellectually answer this question, just answer that question based on your direct observation. Is there a self to be seen anywhere within the body? And now we can apply mindfulness to the mind. That is, observing the mind and any mental events arising in the mind, such as thoughts, emotions, memories, mental images. And again, observing the field of the mind on the basis of the question, is there a self to be seen in the field of the mind anywhere? Or is there simply mental events unfolding? And now we can apply mindfulness to all phenomena. That is, observing whatever appears to the mind, whether it's mental or sensory, and observing that on the basis of the question, is there a self to be seen anywhere? And we can bring the meditation to a close. Just a couple of tips for this practice before we go to Q&A. So there are a number of common experiences we have when we begin this practice. One very common one is that we try to do this Vipassana practice and we find it quite challenging, quite difficult. We're not able to investigate very well. We get lost, we get distracted, we get confused, we don't know what we're looking at, and so forth. And the answer to that is that we need to improve our attention skills. That if our mind is not very calm, clear, and focused, it's going to be very difficult to investigate because this is quite a subtle investigation. And so therefore, if we find that we're not able to investigate very well, then we need to go back and do some more shamatha practice to cultivate mindfulness more, to improve our attention skills, to have a more calm, clear, focused mind. Then come back to Vipassana practice and we'll find it a little bit easier to do that investigation. Another common experience, which I've already mentioned, is that often we tend to turn this into an intellectual exercise. So of course, Vipassana practice is about empirical investigation. But when we ask these sort of questions, then the intellectual mind, of course, wants to answer those questions. So, if the question is there a self to be seen? Where is the self? Then often in the middle of the meditation, the intellectual mind goes, I know the answer. You don't need to look any further. I know the answer. And the answer will be simply based on whatever belief system we happen to have. If we're following some sort of Christian tradition, we may believe in the soul. We go, yep, I'm the soul. That's me, because that's the thing that goes to heaven and hell. Or if we study a bit of Buddhism and we look, there's talk about what goes from life to life, and it often talks about subtle mental continuum, then we go, yep, I know what I am. I'm just the subtle mental continuum, or just awareness, because that's what goes from life to life. Or if we've studied some more sort of New Age traditions that often say that everything in the universe is just subtle energy, then the intellectual mind goes, I know, I'm just subtle energy. And so then, we're not doing the Vipassana practice. Our belief system may or may not be correct, but regardless of that, we're not coming to any insight. So we need to let go of any intellectual ideas and just see what we see what we come up with, be an empirical scientist. Another common experience in this meditation is we do the practice and then fear arises in the practice. And usually that's a very good sign. It's a sort of an existential fear that we're looking and we don't seem to be able to find the me. And because of that, we come to this wrong conclusion that I'm going out of existence or I don't really exist. And so we have this existential fear. So that's actually a good sign. It means we're doing the investigation well, but we are misinterpreting our experience. We're misinterpreting the not finding the self mean there's no me at all. So that's nihilism, and that's why the existential fear comes. So if you're having fear when you're doing this practice, a couple of things you can do. One is ask the question, who's having the fear? Because if you don't exist, there can be no fear. So the fact that you're having fear proves you exist. And the other thing we can do is study a little bit more in terms of this no self, and to appreciate that no autonomous self doesn't mean no me at all. It just means no autonomous self. But then you may ask, well, if there's no autonomous self here, no autonomous me, then how do I exist? Because it seems like I exist, but not the way I think I do. And the answer is that we exist as something merely labeled on the basis of the body and the mind. That's the short answer. The extensive answer on that we'll look at in the next retreat, the retreat on emptiness. So that's a couple of things about the practice in terms of common experiences and what to do about them. So now we have a little bit of time for question answer. So if anyone has any questions, then ask away. Remember, you can also put it in the chat box if you prefer to do that. Yeah, seems like there's no questions. Maybe everyone's come to realize no self, and so there's no questions at all.
Glenn, I'll take the chance to jump in and
Sure.
ask a question. I had the feeling that, it was pretty clear doing this last meditation that the self was nothing inherently in the body, and it wasn't the thoughts or the emotions or the memories. But then when I kind of asked myself the question, then what's left, it was kind of intuitive that there was something doing the investigation the whole time, even if that wasn't always kind of conscious. But the moment I asked that question, it feels like that's the one thing that's left and constantly there, which I guess could be called awareness or consciousness or so.
Right.
But at the same time, it doesn't exist independently of these thoughts in the body and everything. So maybe could you say a little something about that?
Yeah, this is something we'll spend much more time on in the next retreat. But the short answer is that um, we're not negating person. There is a me here. There's someone sitting here meditating. There's someone here doing this Vipassana practice. So yes, there is a me. There is a person. Um, I mean, if we negate that, then we can't. I mean, you have to be here to be able to even ask the question. So what we're trying to discover is our normal sense of self valid? And here we have this, in this particular practice, we have this sense of an autonomous me. There seems to be an autonomous me here. This is instinctive, not something intellectual. And if there is an autonomous me here, something that stands apart from the body and the mind, then we should be able to look here and see that me, because it's something that stands apart from the body and the mind, or it seems to, at least. That's the sense of self we have, this sense there's an autonomous me here, something that's something a little bit more than the body and the mind, stands apart from the body and the mind. Well, if that's the case, and it's not somewhere over there, it's definitely here, then if we look here in the body and the mind, we should be able to see it. And if we can't see it, that should, that should trigger some insight that, well, the me that instinctively seems to be here, this autonomous me, is nowhere to be found. And so that is then an insight into no self. So if we do that investigation and we come to that sort of conclusion or that insight, there's no self to be found here, then we just rest there in that experience. Because that experience, having done a conclusive search, of course, if we don't look thoroughly, then we don't know anything. But if we've done a very thorough search in the body and the mind and we didn't find it, that means it's not findable. There's no autonomous me here. And so then we just rest in that experience of not finding that autonomous self. And that is an experience of no self. And then we hold that experience as long as we can. The longer we can hold that experience, the more it will penetrate the mind, and the more that then it will have an effect after the meditation. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that really means in the next session. Okay?
Great, thanks. It just brings to mind an kind of an example that a teacher once, I can't remember who said it, but they had this analogy of the flashlight trying to shed light onto itself, which it just came to mind, that that example, and it felt like that's what I was trying to do in a way.
Yeah, we're going to look at this in much more depth in the next retreat in terms of emptiness. And as you, I think, mentioned, we don't find yet, there seems to be something there knowing. And so then people, what happens, the next step often is they turn it into intellectual. They go, I didn't find it, but there's something knowing here. And it's actually my awareness that knows that. So, I'm awareness. But then we've gone completely astray in the practice, because that's not our instinctive sense of me. For example, when we get angry at someone, the me that's getting angry, are we identifying with subtle awareness when we get angry? I don't think so. I think the me that's getting angry is not something that we're not sort of seeing ourselves as subtle awareness when we get angry. And we're not seeing ourselves as some subtle vibrations or soul or whatever when we get angry. when we get angry, there seems to be really this strong autonomous me here that's getting angry. That's the me that seems to be here. That's the me that we need to be looking for, because that's the me that we identify with and causes us so much trouble. But more will come in the next retreat.
Yeah, that adds a lot of clarity to the investigation. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. I think we've got time for one more question before we take a break. So anyone have any questions?
Hi, Glenn. Morning.
Hi, Pamela.
Hi. I was in that practice, was first of all observing thoughts going through my mind and not looking for the self and not finding it. And then I experimented with deliberately creating thoughts or images to see if there was any difference, because it just seems that there must be more of a self doing that. And it was interesting because I almost had the sense that they were the same. Yeah, it was the first time I've really experienced that.
Good, yeah. And again, we're not negating that there is a me who has thoughts or a me that's generating thoughts. Of course, there is a me that has thoughts and a me that generates thoughts, but is that me an autonomous self that we can see when those thoughts come up, or when when the thoughts are generated? That's what we need to look for. So yeah, very interesting. Interesting. Good. I think we still got time for one more question if anyone has. Otherwise, we'll go to a break. Yes. Mikol, is it? Yes.
Yes. Interesting. I just wanted to build a little on that, because I had a sense of connecting to something that is actually, you know, when I was 4 years old, I had a couple of experiences where there was like a part in me that said, later in life you will remember this moment, and I did. And you know, it's like I agree with everything you have said, you know, and I love this kind of meditation because it really shows, you know, what happens when I let go of all the stuff that I get caught up in normally. But then I get to a point where it feels like, you know, if I just see what's happening, you know, it's like if you go through things in life, the false selves kind of get caught up in processes of something right or wrong, you know, pain, pleasure, all this stuff. But then at the end of like I've gone through a long process over 2 years now that has kind of been consummated. And then I stand at the end, you know, I hope a little wiser. So it's like there is a sense of having made the mistake along the way that something was wrong, and the self caught up in the false self of things being right or wrong. But then at the end, the process having a sense that there is something deeper than that had to gone through that process to get to a bigger understanding of itself. So it's really difficult to explain, but it's like there is an experience of not a self in the traditional self. That is definitely wrong. You know, person will die. But a sense of process that is continuous.
Sure.
So why, you know, like there's a law of karma. It's like there are things playing out, which some people call destiny in life, you know, which seem to imply some deeper laws, and if nothing else, like life playing out on itself. I don't know what to say with that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you're touching on a lot of points that we'll be looking at in the next retreat in terms of emptiness and particularly dependent arising. And I think some of your questions or points there will be really covered, I think, quite well, hopefully, in that next retreat, because it's really touching on this idea of interdependency. I can't really answer that in a very simple way, but so basically the short answer is that we are not negating existence. We are negating grasping onto false way of existing. And then what's left actually, it's difficult to describe using words, because words and language are conceptual, dualistic in nature, and reality is basically non-duality. And so if you come to this experience, and I think that's why you're struggling a bit to describe it, is because when you come to this experience and then someone asks you, well, what did you experience? You'll go, well, you know, it was sort of a bit like, well, you know, it'll be difficult to put into words because it's beyond that duality. But you know, the sort of the modern take on non-duality often is it's sort of dumbed down to this: we're all one, as if we're sort of one thing or one blob, and that's definitely not non-duality. You know, that's still actually the statement "we're all one" is dualistic talk, and we'll explain why in the next retreat. So that's all coming, all the things you've mentioned here. So hopefully I'll be able to unpack some of those things a little bit better in the next retreat we've got in 3 weeks' time. Okay?
I'll stay curious. Thank you so much.
Sure. Okay, time for a break. So let's take another break and come back in 30 minutes, and we'll continue our no self practice. And then also I'd like to look a little bit about what are the stages of progress in this Vipassana practice. So that's going to come in the next session. So that'll be the last session. So it'll be in 30 minutes time. So let's take a break and I'll see you back in 30 minutes.